First, I'd like to start with a thank you for our sponsors, and especially OpenDNS for this fantastic venue they're letting us have. And if you could, just a quick round of applause. All right, so we've just warmed up the room for our first speaker, which is Tony Martin-Veggie. He has worked for a large global retailer, leading the firm's cybercrime program, including risk analysis, enterprise risk and security analysis, 20 years of technical expertise in network operations, cryptography, and system administration. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Economics from the University of San Francisco, and certifications such as CISP, CISM, and CEH. Tony Martin-Veggie.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I am so excited to be here, and I really want to say thank you to OpenDNS for such a great space here. Was anybody at the DNA Lounge last year for BSides? I was too. The first thing I noticed when I came here is, wow, the floors aren't sticky. So it's a great space. This is my fourth year at BSides, and I've listened to a ton of great talks over the years and yesterday. I've made some great friends, made some really good relationships here, and let me tell you, you all have the great quality of questioning everything. I mean, you people question everything. You question pen test results, you question authority, you question vendor claims, and it was really that quality of questioning that led to the genesis of this presentation idea that I have. So let me ask the room a question really quick. Have you ever read a risk assessment or a vendor security report of the latest boogeyman security threat and just felt like something didn't add up? You felt like just the numbers just didn't make sense to you. Has anybody felt that? I know I feel that all the time. But why question it, right? Of course, these are the experts. They wouldn't be trying to mislead us, would they? They might be. They might be. We're going to dig into that today. So before we get too deep, just a quick introduction about myself. My name's Tony Martin-Veggie. I've been in the IT and InfoSec world for about 20 years now at this point. The usual disclaimers apply. I'm here representing myself, and all opinions belong to me. Feel free to reach out to me over Twitter or email. So, How to Lie with Statistics, the 1954 edition. This was written by Darrell Huff. Huff was the editor of Better Homes and Gardens in the 1940s and 50s, and he had a lifelong passion for statistics. Ironically enough, he wasn't a statistician. He was just a DIY type guy. He wrote a lot of books and a lot of pamphlets on gardening and home repair, that type of thing. But in his personal life, he loved numbers. And through this book in the 50s, he introduced the general public to a lot of concepts, such as correlation does not equal causation, how surveys are used to manipulate people, that type of thing. And I would imagine that everybody has seen the show Mad Men. It was the admin of Madison Avenue that really drew Huff's ire. I mean, this guy really had it out for him. If you read his book, he's constantly hammering away at them. He saw some of the claims they made, like 9 out of 10 doctors think that Newport cigarettes are good for your health, that type of thing. And he just really exposed a ton of that. So what I've done here in this presentation is really taken the foundation that Huff built out 60 years ago, and I've tried to update it for the information security field. It's a little bit modernized, and I'm trying to expose some definite manipulation in our field. But I think that you'll agree with me that the foundation that he laid really is the same. So we're going to go over some classic ways that numbers and statistics are used to bend the truth. We're going to hit 4 main areas today. So number 1, we're going to take a look at how surveys are used, or more often misused. Number two, we're going to look at visuals such as pie charts, line graphs, and bar graphs, and those are used to subtly steer the reader to a particular conclusion. Number three, we're going to look at a term called the semi-attached figure. And this is a phrase used to describe a statistical bait and switch. It's really sneaky. It's also my favorite one. And last, we're going to take a look at the post hoc fallacy. And this is also known as correlation does not imply causation. So let's jump right into surveys. 9 out of 10 households agree that surveys are bad. That's a good statistic, right? Which households? What are we actually talking about here? Surveys are extremely common in the information security space, and after all, who doesn't love infographics? I like looking at them. They're a very effective way to convey little or no information in just a pretty little graphic. It's also the easiest way to steer somebody toward a particular conclusion. So let's back up a moment and talk about surveys. A survey is a poll. Basically what you do is you ask a small group of people a particular question, and then from there you take that small group and you extrapolate the results to apply to the general population. So let me give you an example. Just last week I was reading a survey that said that 59% of CISOs experienced a cyber attack last year in which the attackers were more sophisticated than the defenses. So the survey takers didn't go out and poll all CISOs. That wouldn't be possible or even desirable. They polled a small group of CISOs, and then they extrapolated that to the general population. They said, all CISOs think this. This is a pretty common tactic. Surveys are very common in vendor-sponsored security reports. In fact, I have seen many annual security reports that are based solely on surveys. I can only think of one off the top of my head, the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, that is not survey-based. The rest of them are survey-based as far as I know. And all surveys, including the ones that are quoted in annual security reports, have some sort of built-in flaw, bias, or error. That's just normal, that's to be expected, and that's okay, as long as the survey takers are aware of them and they try to reduce those problems as much as they can, as much as humanly possible. There are many, many annual security reports, academic journals, risk analysis, articles, blogs, tweets, everything that rely on survey data. As security professionals, we take those blogs, articles, journals, annual security reports, we read them, we learn from them, we quote them in steering committee meetings, we use the data for risk analysis. When your manager comes up to you and he or she asks you, what's our exposure to this threat? A lot of people go to annual security reports which are based on survey data. So I can imagine that all of you can see how important it is to get this right. We have to use good data and surveys that are statistically sound. We rely on this data for our firms to make good, risk-aware business decisions. So let's take a look at what surveys are and what makes up a good survey. So surveys such as Gallup polls, they seem really simple on the surface. Gallup polls are most often seen in presidential elections. Who are you most likely to vote for if the election was held today? But the science behind surveys are actually rooted in math and statistics. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of top US universities that offer undergrad and graduate degrees in survey science. So that's how scientific and mathematical surveys are. So there's three main components of a statistically sound survey. Three components. So the first one is population. The survey taker has to know what they're studying. How big is the group? And what is the group? A lot of people even skip that. Next, you have your sample size. This is the size of the group you're studying. So remember, you can't study the entire group. You study a smaller portion of it. A good survey taker will do all they can to make sure that small group is as representative as the big population as possible. And next, we have a really important concept called the confidence interval. And this is your margin of error. It's usually articulated in forms of plus or minus 5 points, that type of thing. You might have seen that in fine print below a Gallup poll. Basically how that works is the larger the sample size, the lower your margin of error is. So those are the components of a statistically sound survey. What happens when a survey is not statistically sound? So you get bias. So just a definition of bias. When you're referring to a survey, one would say that a statistic itself is biased when that statistic is systematically different from the population that's being studied. So your sample doesn't match up with the general population. There are many, many forms of bias that are found in statistics, and by extension, those surveys that use that statistical data. There's probably the one most common form of bias that I see in annual security reports and other statistics used in our field, and that's a bias called selection bias. That happens when individuals are more likely to be selected to participate in your survey than the general population, and that just builds a whole bunch of bias into your report. So I'll give you an example of this. Let's just say you want to do a study on the impact of DDoS attacks at companies. So you, as the survey taker, you go out and you buy an email list. Let's just say you buy 1 million emails. So you construct your email and you tell the people in the email that you must be an information security professional in order to fill out the survey. You say you have to be a pro. And second, if you do fill out the survey, I'll enter you in a drawing to win a $50 Amazon gift card. So I got this email last week. I'm sure you guys see these all the time. So the survey comes back, you compile the results, and this is what you find out. 89% of information security professionals think that DDoS attacks are the biggest threat to their company. So does this sound right? That doesn't make sense, does it? It's not 89% of information security professionals that think this. There's selection bias here. It's 89% of people that actually clicked on your spammy email and filled out your survey, and more often than not, they just wanted to get that $50 Amazon gift card. So how many of those people went through and probably just clicked on anything they possibly could just to get to the end? And we're also have the problem of those survey takers self-identifying themselves as information security professionals. There's no way to check that. So a good survey would do as much as they can to reduce all of those problems I just mentioned. This is exactly what selection bias is. So I don't actually want to call anybody out because I do believe that most people act with the best of intentions. But I really do think I would be remiss if I didn't show you all a real-world example of how bias occurs in our field. So, has anybody heard of a report called The Cost of a Data Breach? I won't mention the name of the research institution, but I will say it rhymes with Pokemon. And the reason why this report bugs me is because it's the most quoted report of all time. I mean, I hear it everywhere. I hear it at work at least once a week. I see it as data for risk analysis, which is dangerous. I see it in blogs. I see it on the news. I see it in the newspaper. I see it in tweets. I see it everywhere. I have the report here. And on the very last page, they disclose their limitations. They disclose their bias. So right off the bat, they disclose non-response and sampling frame bias, which is a form of selection bias. But there's also an interesting disclosure that I want to read to you. And I am quoting here. Statistical inferences, margin of error, and confidence intervals cannot be applied to these data given that our sampling methods are not scientific. Our sampling methods are not scientific. I can't use this. I can't use this in a risk analysis. I can't quote it. I feel like I would lose credibility. So we've gone over some problems with surveys, and let's give some quick tips of how to spot problems in surveys when you're reading reports or articles. So the biggest red flag for me is when a survey methodology isn't listed at all. So I can't say that about the Pokemon Institute. At least they disclose their flaws. A lot of surveys don't even do that. That's a big red flag. Second, no margin of error. If the survey taker isn't disclosing what their confidence interval is, their margin of error, that's another big red flag that the survey itself probably isn't statistically sound. So you might want to run away from that one. And last, vendor sponsored. And let me say that this isn't always the case. There's some great security reports that are issued by vendors, especially the aforementioned Verizon data breach investigation report. That's just a solid report that I reference all the time. But when you're looking at a vendor that's paying for something, you might just want to take a look at motivations and just try to figure out, are they trying to sell me something? That might skew the results a little bit. Just pay extra close attention to that. If something doesn't seem right, investigate a little bit further. So let's move on to the next topic. This is probably the most common way statistics are used to mislead people, graphs. And the reason why is just so easy to create a graph nowadays in Excel. Just select some columns, insert a chart. So this is through data visualization. And data visualization is basically taking numbers that might not mean so much to the naked eye, such as a lot of data in an Excel table or a SQL database, and you basically represent the data visually to help you tell a story. There are many ways to visualize data. We have bar, pies, lines, area, radar, scatter. There's a ton of them. But in this section, I'm only going to focus on 3 main areas of data visualization, primarily because they're the 3 most common that we see in a business setting. We're going to look at first pie charts, which is probably at the same time the most hated way to visualize data and also the most common way, the most loved way. Next, we'll look at line graphs, and then lastly, we'll look at bars. So, the problem with pies. What's wrong with pies? Everybody uses them. Pie charts are extremely common. They're probably the most common form of data visualization, as I mentioned. But the problem with them is that they distort reality. They distort reality that you see. The most important thing to remember about pie charts is that it represents 100%. It's a whole piece. If you don't know what that 100% is, if you don't know what makes up the whole, use something else. Use a bar. So here's a data set that I created. It's pretty simple. It's security incidents in 2014. It's a table view. It's very straightforward. We have 5 data points to visualize. So let's throw this in Excel, create a pie chart, and see what we come up with. So again, pretty straightforward. It's the same data we just saw in the table, but here it's articulated as percentages of a whole. So the whole part, the 100% that I'm talking about, is all security incidents in 2014, and every incident type is a little slice. So some information security professionals, myself included, might want to see the data labels change the actual number of incidents instead of percentages. So right off the bat, that's one way to start masking some data there. I personally would use a bar graph if I was trying to articulate the actual number of incidents instead of a pie chart, but I think that this type of chart is okay. So how could we manipulate this pie to tell a different story? Let's take a look here. So I did some very subtle, sneaky things here. I didn't change the underlying data at all. The numbers are exactly the same underneath. But let's just say that I want to underemphasize hacking incidents. Let's just say that I don't want to talk about hacking at all, and I'd rather shift the conversation over to lost stolen laptops and lost stolen mobile devices. So I did 3 things here. First thing I did is I converted the 2D pie to a 3D pie. This, right off the bat, is the best way to manipulate data because, as you can see, the slices in the front have larger 3D shading. It's much bigger. I moved the x-axis. I basically spun the pie. I spun the purple slice, the one I don't want to talk about, all the way to the back. It doesn't have 3D shading, so visually it just looks smaller. And last, this is really sneaky here, and I'm wondering how many of you caught this just on first glance. I removed the data labels. There's no percentages, there's no number of incidents here. So this right off the bat removes your frame of reference, it removes your scale. So you solely have to rely on your eyes to try to figure out how big each slice is and how much it makes of the whole. So let's take this a little bit further. Let's say that I really, yes, question. 47. Oh, no problem. So let's just say that I really don't want to talk about hacking. I mean, let's just say that I'd rather have a root canal. How can I manipulate it further? So if a little bit of line is good, then a lot must be better. So what I did here is I moved the y-axis. This basically rotated the pie like this. So you're looking at the pie almost straight on. The purple slice, again, is way in the back, and I didn't change any of the underlying data. Underlying data is exactly the same, but this is what I mean by distorting reality. So this looks ridiculous, right? Would everybody agree with me? How many of you have seen this ridiculousness in a business setting? Yeah, a lot of hands. A lot of hands. Don't do it.
What about the tactic of shifting the pie slice up?
Oh, I'm going to do that. You're one step ahead of me. Yes.
You can take it
Yeah. Okay, one last pie. So let's just say that I changed my mind. I want to talk about hacking now. Let's just say this is all I want to talk about, and I want to underemphasize other things. So remember from the previous slide that hacking only makes up 3% of total incidents, but I want to overemphasize hacking. So I did a couple things here. I converted the 3D pie to a 3D exploded pie. I changed the y-axis, I basically spun it, so I moved the purple slice back up front, like it used to be, and I modified the 3D perspective. This is one mouse click in Excel that moves the 3D perspective, and what I did is I just played with it. I just kept clicking until visually the purple slice was as large as possible. Completely distorted reality. I completely changed the story that we're talking about without modifying any underlying data at all. So we've spent a lot of time talking about improper usage of pie charts. A couple quick tips on proper usage of pie charts if you do want to use them. I think one of the first questions you really have to ask yourself is, are pie charts ever appropriate to use at all? There's some really strong opinions on that. Let's look at a couple of those. Nickelback. Walter Hickey's a journalist. He works for Nate Silver's 538. Great website if you're interested in surveys, statistics, visualization. Check it out if you have a chance. There's another opinion. That's a pretty strong one. That's Edward Tufte. He's a visualization pioneer and statistician. Both him and Walter Hickey think that pie charts should never be used. I wouldn't necessarily personally go that far. I think that there's very limited circumstances to use a pie chart, but if you're going to use them, just try to keep a couple things in mind. As I mentioned earlier, pie charts represent the whole. It represents 100% of something. So if you don't know what that whole is, don't use a pie chart. Use something else. Number two, pie charts represent a snapshot in time. That's, today or yesterday. It's a snapshot, 2014. If your data doesn't support being visualized as a snapshot in time, use something else. Number three, your percentages have to add up to 100%. I know, that seems stupid, right? So I have no idea what happened here. My guess is this was a survey, a hated survey, and respondents were probably allowed to select more than one answer. I can only guess, I don't know, but they really should have used a bar chart. Number four, you really want to limit the number of data sets that you're comparing to 3 or 4, 5 maximum. Anything more than 5 really starts to give the reader a really hard time in trying to discern the slices. So you really want to use as few data sets as possible. And lastly, there is no professional reason to ever use a 3D pie chart, in my opinion, or for that matter, an exploded pie. I just think that exploded pies are the worst. It just distorts reality. If Nickelback is synonymous with pie charts, then 3D exploded pies must be Milli Vanilli, because it's just, it's a lie. You're lying, and it's just not accurate. So let's shift gears for a moment and take a look at line graphs. I personally really like line graphs here because it's a little bit harder to manipulate the reader, but it's still possible. So let's take a look at how this happens. So just to set a baseline for everybody, again, here's a table. This is a table of malware infections. It's a fictitious company. This is data from 2014. So taking that data, on the next slide, I created 2 line charts. So let's explain this data really quick. What we're seeing here is a fairly steady rise in malware infections from January to December. So you can see in January that's 419, December it's 510. Over the entire year, there's a 21% rise in malware infections. So just keep that in mind, 21%. Let's take a look at our line graphs. So the first graph on the left is a pretty standard line chart that represents the data well. It represents a slow but steady rise in malware infections. So if you took a look at this, you would think, yeah, that percentage makes sense. Now the second graph on the right tells a completely different story. I didn't change the data. This is the exact same data in both of the charts. But if you look at the graph on the right, you would think, boy, we have a huge problem here. I mean, some might think that we have a malware epidemic at our company, that we have to do something now. All I did was change the vertical axis scale. That's this. On the left, it starts at 0, which is the lowest possible range, because 0 is always a possibility, right? And the upper scale is 600. That's a little bit higher than the highest observed range. The graph on the right is a totally different story. I changed the lower scale from 0 to 400. This makes every change seem much more dramatic. So I think that that's a really big way to mislead people just through simply using line graphs. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Really just always look at the scale that's being used. A good line graph starts at 0. If it doesn't start at 0, ask yourself why. if they're using a different scale than the standard scale, what are they trying to get me to interpret the data as? What are they trying to mislead me toward? It really alters your perception of data when the vertical scales change like that. And as I mentioned, line graphs represent changes over time. It's not a snapshot as opposed to pies. So here's a really misleading line graph. This is a filled line. This is from a presentation that Tim Cook did back in 2013. And this illustrates the sheer number of iPhones that his firm has sold. So there's a couple problems with this. So first of all, what are we even looking at? On my line chart, I manipulated the vertical scale in order to manipulate you guys. There's no vertical scale here at all. It's completely removed. How many units has Apple sold? Is it millions? Is it? We just don't have any idea. Yes.
But that's not exactly the story here, right? I mean, they're not. If they wanted to say how many units that were sold, they would just put up a one gigantic number, and that number represents the number of units sold. The story that he's telling here is completely different. The story here that he's saying is how sharply increasing the sales of the iPhones have been in the past few years.
Right.
As far as that, that's right.
This one is?
Yeah.
Okay.
As far as showing the increase in the slope of the sales.
I
bet there's a punchline coming. So I don't want to tease away the.
Yeah. There is a punchline. I do disagree with you, but I'll get to that in just a moment. Okay. There's a couple different ways to visualize the data here. So what we're looking at here is a steep blue mountain of goodness that there sure are a ton of units that are being sold. I think that the problem I have with this graph is using the concept of cumulative sales. I feel like it's misleading. This leads the reader to believe that this is how many iPhones are out there. And that's really not the case, because iPhones break, they're thrown away, they're traded in, they just fall into disrepair. I do think it's okay to tell people number of units sold, cumulative sales. I think that that's okay. But you have to give the reader context. You can't just throw up a line graph like this without any context. How do you add context? This is how I think the chart should have looked. This is from a blogger at quartzqz.com. He overlaid a bar chart on top of the cumulative line chart that really adds a vertical scale, it adds labels, and it adds context to the concept of cumulative sales. So I hope that answers your concern a little bit. So bar graphs too, what could possibly be wrong with bar graphs? Bar graphs don't have some of the same inherent errors that pie charts have, but they still can be manipulated. Bars are really good for comparing two or more items, and they're really good when you're trying to show how something changes over time. So just want to spend a quick moment and look at a bar graph. So here's two of them. The underlying data is identical, but does anybody know what I did here? It's the vertical scale again. It's that pesky vertical scale. On the right, I changed the scale to start at 200 instead of 0, and it makes the increase in social engineering attacks seem much more drastic. I think that the one on the left is a little more visually reasonable. So let's move on to, yes?
Is there any context where having a non-zero base is valid, or explain when I might not feel sad?
There are. There's a great book, which I reference at the end, from Edward Tufte that shows all the different ways to statistically use bars and line graphs. So next topic, the semi-attached figure. And this has to be my personal favorite because it's so pervasive everywhere. It's also really hard to spot unless you're specifically looking for it. So a semi-attached figure is when a proof is given for a claim. So you have your proof here, and you have your claim here. The reader looks at it, and upon closer inspection, these two items are not related to each other at all. The reason why it's called semi-attached is because the proof seems attached to the claim, but it's more often than not, it has nothing to do with it. Marketing types and advertising professionals are absolute masters of the semi-attached figure. Two common examples. I know that semi-attached figure is kind of a hard concept to grasp without good examples. So I want to give you two quick ones that it's not necessarily security related, but it helps understanding. So does anybody remember the Certs commercial that ends with "now with Retson"? That's the semi-attached figure. What the fuck's Retson? Right? I mean, it sounds good. It sounds like it will make stinky breath less stinky. But what exactly does Retson have to do with certs? I mean, it's a chemical inside of the breath mint, but in the advertising campaign, they're not attaching the two together. Another example is when a marketing claim says 25% better. 25% better than what? You have a statistic, 25% being offered as proof for a claim, you should buy this great product, but they're not attached to each other. Semi-attached figure. So this marketing claim, I don't know if anyone remembers this. I first saw the phrase unbreakable back in 2006. I was driving up the 101, and I saw a huge billboard that just said, "Unbreakable Oracle." And I just kind of went like this. I didn't know what to even think of this claim. So for those of you that don't remember it, this is referring to Oracle Linux, which is basically Red Hat Linux. It's a derivative. This is classic bait and switch. The vendor's making a statement, unbreakable, and they're trying to lead the reader to associate that with Linux, Oracle Linux. The two are not attached to each other. Of course, Linux is not unbreakable. There's no such thing. Nothing is. Oracle Linux has been subject to the same vulnerabilities that Red Hat Linux has been to, over the years. It just reminds me of so much of now with Retson. It's the same thing. Unbreakable. So when you buy software that's unbreakable, what exactly are you buying? Are you buying something that can't be hacked? Something that can't experience downtime? Something that can be patched without having to experience a reboot? Are we referring to high availability here? We don't know. There's no connection there. So Oracle almost immediately started backing away from this claim. They still use this as a marketing piece, but now they say that it refers to a process, not a product. So, I know. Yeah.
You're buying the fact that the CIO saw it on some cloth in it. That's what you're buying.
Exactly. So another example of the semi-attached figure. This is a true story. I was sitting in a meeting, previous employer, it was quite some time back, and a vendor put this graph up on the screen. This is the number of cybersecurity incidents reported to federal agencies from 2006 to 2012. Now, just looking at this is a fine graph. I don't have any problems with it. The vendor was selling us next generation firewall technology. The people in the room fell silent as the vendor started their lecturing pitch. He started in on us. Look at this graph from 2006 to today. There's a 10-fold increase in cyber attacks. We're at war. We're at war here. And you, he was pointing to us in the room, you are not adequately protecting yourself in this cyber war. The current equipment you have cannot protect you against this type of unrelenting attacks. And the salesman went on and on and on and on and on. Does anyone see a semi-attached figure here? That's one of them, yeah. Yeah, what are we talking about? Right. Right. The- They're making a ton of presumptions about data that we don't even really know what's being represented here. So the vendor was really trying to lead us to believe that the sky was falling, and who knows, maybe it is. I attended some talks yesterday that certainly would lead me to believe that there's doom and gloom on the horizon, but this graph has nothing to do with that. So just there's some great comments here, but a couple of probing questions I was thinking when the vendor was giving us this pitch. So let's just assume that cyber attacks have increased tenfold since 2006. Let's just say that the graph is right. Why? Why have they increased? Are there more computers in 2012 than there were in 2006? There might be. Are there more websites to attack? That's also a possibility too. You're not hearing the full story here. What the number that I want to see is the ratio of attack surface versus attacks. Is detection of attacks better in 2012 than they were in 2006? Are we seeing more? Are we responding to more? So there's just a ton of questions that you would ask when somebody throws this graph up and tries to give you a doom and gloom marketing spiel. So there's a lot of things that somebody can do with data like this. And in the next and final section here, let's see what happens when somebody takes two data points, something, one of the data points might be this, and they claim that one causes the other. But when you inspect it more closely, you realize that there's no causation there at all. And this is correlation does not imply causation. So this is also known as the post hoc fallacy. And the explanation is simple enough. Just because two data points correlate with each other, it doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other. This is a logical fallacy called a spurious correlation. It was coined by Carl Pearson, who's a great statistician in the 1800s. So let's take a look at a couple of spurious correlations. This is a great one. It's not security related, but I think it's... It's great, I know. So this is from the website of Tyler Vigen. He's analyzed hundreds of data sets, and he's found really weird, amazing correlations. This one here, for those of you that can't read it, this is the number of people who drowned by falling into a swimming pool. That correlates with the number of films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in. So the website's really worth checking out if you're interested in logical fallacies and data. So just a really quick sidebar, go off topic for a moment. Does anyone find anything interesting or strange with this graph? I copied it directly from his website. The vertical axis. The vertical axis was changed in order to make the two data sets correlate. So I put the same data in Excel just to see what would happen if I started the vertical axis at 0 and there's no correlation. The data doesn't flow together. But it's just an example of how you can manipulate graphs in order to lead the reader to a certain conclusion. It's just another example of why you really need to question everything. So let's switch gears and look at another example here. This is a chart. Reported lost or stolen mobile devices correlates with the number of users that completed security awareness training. So I was in a room a while back with a few auditors and some other security people that I worked with. And the lead auditor that I was working with was very, very concerned about a rash of BYOD phones that were being reported lost or stolen. The auditor was absolutely positive he knew the reason why we had so many stolen devices. And he took the liberty of taking data and throwing it in a chart very similar to this. I've omitted the company name, of course, to protect the guilty. The auditor looked very grimly at me. He looked directly at me because I rolled out security awareness training at the company. And he said, "You're causing this." I didn't know what his angle was. I thought, how could I be causing this? Did I steal all of those phones? He said, "You are teaching people that confidential information's on their phones. You're basically telling people the value of sensitive information, and they're stealing it." It's true. So his reasoning was that prior to the security awareness training, people were blissfully ignorant about the treasure trove of information that was on their iPhones. And now they knew that they had valuable data, so they were stealing their own phones in order to exfiltrate data out of the company. But if you look at this combo chart, if you look at this, it certainly supports his hypothesis, doesn't it? I mean, it makes total sense. You would think that there's a direct correlation between the rollout of security awareness training and lost or stolen mobile devices. Does that make sense? It's a spurious correlation. So I am actually seeing more of this lately, not less, and I think that it's a disturbing trend. I think that the cause of this is the availability of big data. People have a ton of data at their fingertips, and it's very easy for the casual reader with a little bit of Excel to draw casual relationships and immediately jump to conclusions. Has anybody heard the phrase, "let the data do the talking"? Yeah, a lot of people. I run when I hear that. Post hoc fallacies occur when people aren't careful enough when they reason. Data's not an end to itself. Data's used to construct a hypothesis and test it. Even just a casual investigation into the underlying data is enough to avoid committing these types of logical fallacies a majority of the time. So just in conclusion, to wrap up this graph, of course, security awareness training didn't cause people to steal their own phones. I performed just a really quick investigation. I called some of the people that reported their lost, stolen mobile devices and just asked them a couple questions about the circumstances around the incident. To make a long story short, what I found out is there is a correlation between the two data points, but it's exactly the opposite of what the lead auditor alleged. People just simply weren't aware of the requirement to report their lost or stolen mobile devices. They didn't know that they had to report it to our SOC. So the security awareness training educated people to that fact. They got wise and they just started reporting their mobile devices. So this is actually really good numbers, not bad. The uptick that we're seeing here is caused by the training, not really an effect of it. So just to conclude here, a couple tips and resources. Daryl Huff called the manipulation of statistics statisticulation. It's a combination of manipulation and statistics. So there's some, hopefully you all have additional tools in your toolbox. I really do encourage all of you to always try to assume good intentions. Most people aren't set out to manipulate people, not all the time at least. I really don't believe that most people or even vendors are out there to deceive people. They just don't understand some of the underlying concepts of statistics, logical fallacies, data manipulation. Another tip I think that I try to employ all the time is looking at the source of the data, whether it's a survey or a graph or a pie chart, and just checking it out yourself if that's even possible. If there isn't a source given, or if you check that source and there isn't a methodology behind that data collection, don't trust it. Just be a little bit more suspicious of it. Finally, don't believe everything you read just because it seems science-y or because it has a lot of data attached to it. Stephen Colbert has a great word for this. He calls it truthiness. A truthiness is a truth that is a truth because it just simply feels right, without any regard to evidence, facts, or logic. So lastly, here's some additional resources. Of course, there's Daryl Huff's book. The Edward Tufte book is a great resource if you're interested in data visualization. And How to Measure Everything by Douglas Hubbard. This has become my Bible when trying to measure things or do data collection. Just really recommend that book. So thank you, everybody, for coming today. Are there any questions? Yes.
So the causation correlation, what you showed was a really awesome example. I guess I feel like there are times when I want to, I'm a professional, and I actually think these are related. Going and actually proving causation would take way more time than it, so I feel like I want you to tell me that it's okay to show things sometimes, just to not be an idiot.
I think that even just a casual investigation into something is enough to eliminate that type of logical fallacy a majority of the time. Even just a little bit of investigation. Something like...
Like if you were doing an academic paper wouldn't be enough, but hey, it's just industry here.
Right. Something like this had no investigation whatsoever. It was just, the guy just pulled it out of his ass. Yeah. Yeah.
The biggest lie here is that there's two different scales, right? So if you can somehow put your data on the same scale, even if it's in terms of percentage, it's already going to be able to work. Especially if you're talking about the same organization, same users, same systems, the metrics, and it's in the percentage scale, it's going to be much more.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. Yes, over there.
If you go back to like all the pie chart examples, a couple slides back, I think the last one that you showed had so it had like the stolen phones, the hacking incident, and the security incidents. Was there a reason why you added that 6 field, that security incidents in 2014? Was it just to like illustrate a bad pie chart, or is there a reason for that first entry right there for security incidents?
Oh, that's a typo. Yeah. See, don't trust pie charts. Thank you. Anything else? Yes.
Besides the post hoc fallacy, do you see any other common fallacies realized in data visualization?
The question was, besides post hoc fallacy, are there any other common bias or fallacies? Yes, confirmation bias. Wanted to cover that here. It's basically you are more likely to believe an assertion or believe data if it confirms your pre-existing beliefs. I think that that's probably the biggest problem in common risk management methodology today is the confirmation bias. Yes?
Further, you apply the data to support your beliefs and exclude, can't even see, turn blinders on to anything that can possibly negate what you believe to be true.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, we're about out of time. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate it.